Welcome to the alumni joining us from Africa and Europe. Good evening to the alumni, students and friends in China. I'm incredibly excited to hear our guest speaker today, Professor Pascal Lamy, who will be talking about the impact of the pandemic on world trade. I am equally thrilled to have with us Professor Ding Yuan, who will actively participate in our conversation. Thank you both very much for your time and availability. Today's different landscape has forced our alumni chapter to embrace its digital future. The digital community stands now, more than ever, at the center of alumni life. It is the place where we, alumni, connect. A couple of ground rules for this digital interaction. After the keynote speech, we will open the session for a few live questions. Listen carefully as I announce your name because you will be unmuted. For those of you asking live questions, please make sure you are in a quiet environment. After these live questions, we will open up and allow a couple of our other alumni friends to intervene before moving on with a further conversation between Professor Ding Yuan and Professor Lamy. Please, when you want to submit your questions, use the Q&A function in the bar along the bottom and not the chat function. You can use the chat function because we like interaction, but just remain mindful of what you send and to whom you send it to. Now, without further ado, he is one of the most passionate teachers on campus, the driving force of our school internationalization. Of course, we are talking about the Dean and Vice President of our school. Today, we are fortunate enough to have him as a participant. Professor Ding Yuan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for your very nice house rules and also the introduction. So I'm here to introduce our Professor Pascal Lamy. You all know that since 2018, we are honored to have Professor Lamy as one of our distinguished professors and teaching regularly in our different campuses. I remember in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, and this year we thought about Beijing, but now given the virus situation, we will try to start a virtual version of his inspiring lecture first. And of course, people always say that the heavy-weighted person like Pascal doesn't need any introduction. And of course, that's certainly true with his high caliber positions taking in French government, but also in European commissions. And then later on, he was the driving person behind a huge organization who's now created a lot of tension, which is WTO. And for that reason, Pascal told me he lived in Geneva for more than 80 years. And since then, he's still leading some very important think tanks in Europe and still extremely active, working on the globalization, the European integration, and he's giving advice to many European leaders. So we are very honored to have Pascal to squeeze out every year some of his precious time to work with our students and to share regularly and his insightful knowledge and advice. So we are very, very honored, especially in this particular time with the pandemic situation all around the world, the confinement and the geopolitical tension, but also the risk to see the biggest recession we never saw in our life. So we'd like to welcome Pascal to share his insights and maybe to show us some of his crystal ball ideas. Thank you, Pascal, please.
Well, hello everybody, good to see you, my friend. Good to know that CEIBS and its alumni are alive and well. I'll give you, in order to start this conversation, a few remarks, starting with one caveat, which is a note of caution given the huge amount of uncertainties that remain. We know it's a major global shock of a magnitude which is unprecedented, probably since the Second World War, but we still have a lot of questions on what next, on the time horizon, on how this sequence between sanitary, economic, social, political, global consequences will play. So it's not time for prediction, it's time for some sort of prospective views of how will this world be impacted by this COVID-19 crisis. And a number of us on this world are working very hard in various configurations in Europe, between Europe and US, between Europe, US and China, to try and guess as rationally as possible what the next post-COVID world, whenever that is, will look like, not only to prepare for that. And history has shown us that post-crisis has been better managed when the post-crisis was thought, organized during the crisis than after the crisis. Second introductory remark, of course, what's for sure, whatever doubts or uncertainties we may have on how all this will unfold, what is sure is that A, it is a global crisis, and B, it will have an impact on globalization. And my remarks today are about what I see as the main impact of this COVID crisis globally and how they will play on globalization, both in its infrastructures and also in its superstructures, infrastructures being the economic systems, superstructures being the political systems, such as global governance and multilateralism. Now, to start with what I believe will be the major changes as compared to the pre-COVID world, I would say more government, more precaution, less growth, more digital, more inequalities between countries, and less inequalities within countries. This is a sketchy description of what I see as the major impacts. More governments, bigger governments comes from the crisis, its nature, and the way it has been coped with. The main source of the crisis, if you eliminate the question of how did this virus appear, the main source of the crisis is that most, if not only governments, were poorly prepared for such a shock. So governments had to step in the first line. They did it with a lot of public intervention. They've totally opened the tape of public finance, whether it's central bank, whether it's national budgets. They've had to take tough decisions to impose a new social order, which is called confinement. All this means that it will take time before this huge stepping in of government steps back in the future. So brace for a period where government will be more influent in the economy, in society. Second, I think, major impact is more precaution, because this is also one of the origins of this crisis and of the dissemination of the virus worldwide. There was not enough precaution, and given the connection between health and death, which is a huge emotional bond in all human societies, brace for an increase in the level of precaution worldwide. Not only for health, by the way, probably also for environment. This is what I call precautionism as compared to protectionism. The world pre-COVID, there was a danger of protectionism, countries protecting domestic producers from foreign competition. The world post-COVID will be in a danger of excessive precautionism, i.e. measures to protect people who have a big impact on trade and on globalization. Third impact of all this combined, more government, more precaution, more regulation, more frictions within the economy and to international exchange, will be less growth. There will be a global repricing of risk, and a higher price of risk means a lower growth. This is a fundamental feature of global market capitalism. Less growth will mean more problems for poor countries and for poor people in rich countries. The level of uncertainties of the impact of COVID crisis in the developing world, I'm not talking about China, I'm not talking about Europe, I'm not talking about Japan or US, but in the rest of the world is still unclear. But the likely impact is to be much more severe even than it has been in China, Europe, US so far. Within our societies, less growth will mean harder times for poor people, but as a consequence of the crisis, my guess is that countries, at least in the north, rich industrialized countries, will have to increase welfare because of the social divide which this crisis has revealed in many countries. Even in Europe, which has a very relatively thick welfare state system that buffers the impact of this sort of economic shock on populations, there has been more social divide during the crisis, and this is not over, not to speak about the US. So all in all, a global world, a globalization, which will be more difficult to harness, more difficult to govern. And this is clear if we look at the impact, which I will do now, on the infrastructures of the economy, globalization being both a process, which is roughly a process of multi-localization of production systems, whether goods or services, but globalization being also a state of superstructures, a certain composition and structure of multilateral international governance. Because of the impact I briefly summarized, too briefly, but that's the rule of the game, I think the impact on infrastructures will make, as I said, governance more difficult. What will be the main impact on the economic infrastructures, i.e. the multilateralization of production systems? I see two main impacts. The first one is some reconfiguration of production chains. And the second one is a certain form, the quantum of which is unclear, of de-leveling of the playing field. And both of these impacts raise problems of governance, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There will be some reconfiguration of production chains, not a de-globalization. I do not believe a post-COVID world will be de-globalized, but I believe globalization will be a bit different. There will be some shortening of value chains. There will be some reshoring, and notably in areas where they have appeared too fragile. And this is an addition to what had happened before the COVID crisis during the US-China trade war, where the world of tech had already started some sort of decoupling. So brace for a bit more of that. Although I'm not among those who saddle the COVID crisis with globalization. And as you know, there is quite a large debate, at least in Europe and in the US now, and I participate in some of these debates, which is whether or not globalization is to be blamed for the COVID crisis. I do not agree with that. If there's something that has to be blamed with the COVID crisis, it's the impreparation of sovereigns. It's not globalization who was unprepared. It's countries, sovereigns, government that were unprepared. Had we had stocks of masks or respiratory devices the way we have stocks of oil, and roughly every country on this planet agreed many years ago that we should all have 90 days of reserves of oil because this is a big problem for the working of our economies, we probably would not have lived through this ordeal. Yet, there will be more precaution. Some firms will reallocate, rebuild the trade-off. As a CEO of a company, I've always had to balance efficiency and resilience. The balance between efficiency and resilience, which is key to the core of a number of business models, will move towards less efficiency and more resilience. This will have a consequence on the configuration of production system, although, as I said, not a deglobalization, not least because, and you've already heard me say that at the CEIBS, I know by experience that globalization is painful and efficient. And I think I also view that deglobalization will be painful and inefficient, but there will be some sort of less efficiency for the sake of more resilience. This is the first impact. The second impact, I think, has to do with a more unlevel playing field. Government stepping in big way, the way they did, results in a sea of nationalizations, de facto or de jure, results in a huge flow of subsidies. And we are not out of that because this is the part during the crisis, but there will need to be more subsidies, more public money, more stepping in governments in order to stimulate the economies when the time comes, which probably has already started in China, but not yet in Europe, and probably not in the US a fortiori. This situation will create different trade distortions, different forms of subsidies or support in different directions for different reasons, according to cultural, political, cognitive differences. So we will have a higher level of fragmentation through this public subsidization of market capitalism. And this, of course, will result in a more heterogeneous globalization, as will, by the way, the increase of precaution. And the reason for that is that precaution means different things to different people. Precaution is a sort of risk management between what's good and what's bad. And what's good and what's bad for the Chinese people may be different from what's good and what's bad for European people, which may be different from what's good and what's bad for US people. So to the difference of protection, precaution is much more linked to cultural, cognitive differences. So a world of more precaution will be a world which will be more heterogeneous. And if I take one example, which is the medical industry, we all know if you're in the pharma business, if you're in the business of drugs, if you're in the business of medical devices, your problem has not really been tariffs. Your problem, if you produce this sort of things, if you manufacture this sort of things, your main problem is the regulatory structure of the market you want to export to. And this, for obvious reasons, needs precaution. You cannot market a drug or a medical device without a lot of precautionary processes, certification. The problem being that they usually are very different, which entails these economies of scale. So, in a nutshell, this means that we probably will be in a world where firms compete less, but governments compete more. Compared to the pre-COVID world, where global capitalism was a sort of global competition of firms with, of course, some government intervention, the proportion post-COVID will be different. Governments will compete with one another more than in the pre-COVID world, and firms, notably because they will be more supported by governments, will be less competing with each other or on different parameters, and this is a change. And that leads me to my final point, which is that in this context, which frankly doesn't look good, we will need more international cooperation. We will need more multilateralism. We will need more disciplines in order to avoid this post-COVID world to become the law of the jungle. And this is a big problem because multilateralism is in a bad shape. Multilateralism was in a bad shape before the COVID crisis. We've seen that. The sort of progressive edification of a multilateral system, of a global governance system, has roughly stopped at the time of the mid-90s, and there were strains that appeared. A, because the system that was built after the Second World War did not really fit with the new geopolitical organization of the world, including the rise of Asia and China and a few other emerging countries, and more recently, because the US elected in 2016, a president who was a unilateralist and who campaigned on a unilateralist platform. This has had an impact on the way the COVID crisis has been managed. I think it's fair to say that the level of international engagement, international cooperation, whether by UN, the WHO, whether by the G20 or the G7, is extremely low, mediocre, compared to previous episodes, and notably the 2008 crisis, even if they are obviously of a different nature. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. It took 3 months for a meeting of the UN Security Council to take place on the COVID crisis with no result. As we know, the level of coordination in the G20 and in the G7 is extremely low. We have this US-China war of words, which doesn't make things easier. We have this controversy about the role of the WHO, and notably at the beginning of the crisis. So we are not in a good shape. And I think that what I said on the likely impact of the COVID on globalization, on the global economy, on more competition between states, which have become more powerful, which are in a way more sovereign as a consequence of the crisis than before the crisis, will make multilateralism in a way more necessary, and on the other side, probably more difficult. And this is something that deserved extreme attention. And that's my conclusion for today. The post-COVID world will be more dangerous. There will be more rivalries. It will be more fragmented. And this necessitates a new form, a new impulse, a new effort of international cooperation. We know the way to go. We have to reform a number of international institutions. We have to use informal governance systems such as the G20 or other informal organizations more efficient. We have to engage in global cooperation other than sovereigns, civil society, some businesses, big academic institutions. That's what we do with the Paris Peace Forum, and we are still preparing the 3rd edition of the Paris Peace Forum, which will take a different shape than the one it had in the first time in 2018 and the second time in 2019. We are working on something which is more virtual than physical, but still, we still want to try and move in this direction. The big problem of all this being that international cooperation needs US, China, and Europe to work together. I'm not saying it's the only condition, but it is now a necessary condition. This triangle is a necessary structure of a post-COVID world, which we have to try and make it better rather than worse, against, as I said, likelihood. The big problem being, of course, that there is a huge integration mark on the US attitude. We know that for the moment, the US is retreating from multilateralism, is retreating from international cooperation. This leaves China, which is a huge, powerful country, and Europe, which is still in a very lengthy and sometimes frustrating process of integration. This leaves China and Europe in the first line, which is why I believe that there's a plan A, which is US going back to playing ball, and there's a plan B, which is US remaining where it is, and this implies more responsibility, more engagement by both China and Europe. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Pascal Lamy, for sharing with us your views on the global impact of the pandemic and its impact on globalization. Let us immediately open the floor for a mix of live questions. For those of you asking live questions, let me repeat myself, please make sure you are in a quiet environment. I have with us Robert Straw, CEO of CEIBS Switzerland. Robert, will you kick off our Q&A with your first comment or question?
Yes, Professor Lamy, thank you very much for your sobering remarks, and sober they are. I do have a question though. Is there any silver lining in this crisis?
I'm a man of hope. I'm not an optimist, I'm not a pessimist, but I'm a man of hope. I'm an activist, and I try to work so that what I hope will happen rather than not happen. You're absolutely right. What I just painted is a sobering description of a post-COVID world with, again, all the uncertainties I have mentioned. There is, of course, a better scenario. There is a better scenario if this virus triggers another part of human nature, of cultures, which is something which is more with cooperation rather than with rivalries, which is something which is with more attention to the environment, which is something where there is more attention to people, and notably to the weaker part of society. This is a possible scenario. As I just said in an interview in a French-speaking newspaper, in the Western world, and notably in Europe, we have a problem which is a confusion between the globalization of fear and the fear of globalization. And these are two different things. We are witnessing a globalization of fear with this crisis. This may result in more fragmentation, in more rivalries, the sort of scenario I painted where the strong get stronger, the weak get weaker, and the world is a less peaceful world. There can be another scenario, but this would need, for instance, much more cooperation at international level on things like environment or health. No doubt health will move up the international agenda. I have no doubt about that. We all know that this international sanitary regulation has been basically a piece of paper and not a serious treaty to which countries of this planet abide to, and there are obligations in there. So there may be another scenario, but this will need an effort of cooperation. I'm not excluding it, because what we've seen in our countries, and I'm speaking for Europe and for my country, France, is a mix of reactions of defense, fear, blaming others, the foreigners, the virus, the governments, and on the other side, some reactions of intense cooperation, of manifestations of solidarity, or even of love that probably would not have existed in a less strained situation. But it still, in my view, for the moment at least, remains plan B.
Thank you very much.
Good. From Switzerland, we go to Spain, where the president of the Spain Alumni Chapter should be ready with his question. Albert Valero, please share your question with the audience and Professor Lamy.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor. I would like to ask two questions. How do you balance like this competition between governments and also the need of international cooperation? So you've mentioned this in your discussion, but how is this going to happen, or how do you see it happening, right? Because obviously you compete, but you have to cooperate. It seems like opposite things, right? Also, what is the role that you see the EU playing in Europe, considering the tensions that are in terms of the debt, the mutualization of debt, and the Euroscepticism, and also going into more like unification of Europe? How do you see that going? Thank you very much.
So, good questions. And I'm, of course, following the situation in Spain very closely, because as you may know, the Spanish foreign minister is my former chief of staff. So she's been working with me during 10 years. And I'm glad that during this period, the Spanish government has put such a solid, expert, active, and serious lady in charge. On your first question, if I am right, that governments will have a larger role, this makes international cooperation, at least on the economic side, more difficult. If firms compete, the rules of the game for firms' competition within a capitalist system are by the governments, and the governments can together agree that they will submit this to this regulation, or this to that form of taxation, or that they will increase more or less the price of carbon, to take an example. If it is a competition between governments, if it is about a power game, if you transfer the pressure of making profits, which is the internal machinery of global capitalism, to a machine to create power and influence, this will make global cooperation more difficult. And this is where I am worried, notably if the US keep moving out of international governance, because their president believes that this is bad for the US. I, of course, totally disagree with that, and some of my US friends disagree with that. So far, they've been in a minority, at least in electoral terms. On EU, in some way, the European Union is a sort of mini globalization. It's a sort of lab of globalization, which is putting in common more of our economies, more of our structures of governance, more of our collective preferences. And by the way, the founding fathers of the European Union at the time thought that this process of economic integration would lead to political integration, and that the countries in Europe would be better off, and notably with peace. And in a way, what's happened globally from the 1950s to the 1990s, let's say to the years 2000, was a sort of soft economic and political integration, soft as compared to the EU one, which is harder than the rest. For this reason, this crisis is a big test for the European Union. It's a test of solidity, it's a test of solidarity. And this test is a very severe one, because we all know that for obvious anthropological reasons, solidarity is bigger in a small group than in a big group. Solidarity is higher at national level rather than at European level. It may be a bit higher at European level than at international level. Still, there is a solidarity level difference that makes European integration more difficult in these times. I think personally that this crisis is a test, and that the EU will not, we will not exit this crisis with the same European Union. It's going to be either stronger or weaker. You probably can guess where my preferred option is. I've been working on European integration for many years in my life. And I believe, by the way, that if the post-COVID world is a more dangerous one, we need a stronger Europe. The world will need a stronger Europe, but countries in Europe will also need a stronger Europe if they want to have some weight, notably in this US, China dominated world. We have signals of division. We have signals of unity. And as you know, there will be a European Council this week that will decide or confirm that the first big 500 billion package, which comes from European Union decisions, will be agreed. There still are big question marks on whether the next one, which is a sort of post-crisis stimulus, which probably has to be double, 1,000 billion of euros. There still are, as you know, many question marks on how should this be organized. I personally have declared already publicly that I am in favor of Corona bonds, which is the EU balance sheet being the basis of borrowing money for this 1,000 billion, which we will need.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good. One more live question before we take your written comments. This one is coming from Kenya. Nadia Nsambimbona from the African EMBA 2015. Please, Nadia, the stage is yours.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Professor. I'm really honored to be here and listen to your amazing, deep analysis on the situation. I'm going to speak with the perspective of somebody who works from the World Health Organizations. I am into fundraising for this region. I liked what you said about the three trends that we're going to see about multilateral system. And I like what you say about resilience and effectiveness. This, I'm seeing it completely in this continent, where I see more of resilience rising. As we can see, there's no more much cases. It's like the curve is more flattened, you know, at a certain exception from South Africa and other countries, in comparison to what we see for the rest of the world. I see a lot of ineffectiveness, which is business as usual, because the health system in this continent is really weak, and we are seeing it. But for some reasons, the curves is really flattened. It's not. We are not seeing yet the peak, which may come or not. We are receiving also a lot of support globally from the EU, from bilateral and multilateral organizations, which is a very great thing for WHO to support countries. But since you're talking about after COVID, for this Africa continent, which is, I mean, I would say in the future, if you have something like this again, a pandemic like this is going to be more affected than others because of the level of preparedness. Yes, the continent were not prepared for such a pandemic. We were thinking maybe the rest of the world, Europe, America, Asia, the level of preparedness was at a good level to respond to such a pandemic. which was not the case, unfortunately, and surprisingly, by the way. But what we see in Africa, the peak is not yet there, but it may come, it may not come, you know. According to certain analysis, the peak is going to come anyway, you know. Let's talk about after COVID. Yes, we may respond at a certain level, we may contain the pandemic with the means that we have at that time. We are trying our best. What would be your take-home advice to WHO and the government in countries like, in countries in Africa, low, middle, and high income? Over to you, Professor.
Well, first, I think you are right. Speaking from Nairobi, it may look a bit strange to think about the world after COVID, while the impression is that Africa is not yet in full expansion of the virus. And China started before Europe, Europe started before US, and I think the general consensus is that Africa will follow, although probably with a different model. What China, Europe, and US have decided is to damage the economy in order to save lives. This trade-off may not be the African trade-off.
Yeah.
Not because governments would not like to emulate this Chinese, Europe, US trade-off, but because the capacity to do that is not there.
Yeah.
So my guess is that the balance between efficiency and resilience, the balance between saving lives and saving jobs will be different in Africa. It's a guess, because we know the numbers are quite different. So it may be that there will be a bigger loss of lives during a moment, leading maybe to a higher level of collective immunity, leading to less economic damage at the end of the day. I'm not sure this will be the case. There is another scenario, which, as you know, is a much worse case. But I think in these conditions, what we have to do is to try and avoid that a continent like Africa is more severely damaged than the other ones. It can be the case because of economy, although a large part of the African GNP is domestically generated, contrary to what many people believe. The African economies do not depend essentially on exports. But I think yet what has been proposed and put in place with the IMF, the World Bank, within the G20, the European Union, is one of the areas where there has been a bit of cooperation as compared to the rest. So this is, I think, an area where quite soon we all realize that some countries were not in a position to afford the sort of trade-off which China, Europe, and US decided, hence a bit more cooperation in this area.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Professor. Professor, a question for you. This is coming in from VJ in Japan. What sort of influence can the WTO have in this post-COVID-19 future where governments are competing against each other?
Well, we had a webinar yesterday with the China Center on Globalization with a few old trade hands, trade wonks. And that's precisely the question we try to address. I think in this world where states will be stronger and competing more with each other, we probably need a stronger rather than a weaker WTO. And we probably need some sort of reprioritization of the WTO agenda. Things like export restrictions, for instance, have appeared as a serious problem during this crisis. There's still a risk that after some export restrictions on medical stuff, there's still a risk of export restrictions in food. 25 countries on this planet have already engaged in export restrictions on food, which, as we know, is a big threat to the food security of others. So export restrictions is clearly a candidate. A sectoral agreement on 0 for 0 on medical stuff, drugs, medical apparatus is something that comes to mind if we have to try and cooperate internationally to draw the right consequences of this crisis. Although, as I already mentioned, the problem in the medical and pharma industry is not so much tariffs, but the alignment, the harmonization of precautionary systems that de facto are non-tariff barriers to trade. So this is another area where we probably would need stronger international disciplines. Subsidies is also an area that comes to mind. As we know, the WTO system of disciplines on subsidization is rather weak. There was always a problem with this. This is an issue that came into the field, notably between US, EU, Japan on the one side and China on the other side before the COVID crisis. There was a problem in the difference of subsidization, of control by the state, the Chinese economy on the one side and the rest of the world on the other side. By the way, if I'm right in my sketchy description of possible impact, it might be that US and EU and Japan will look more like China after the crisis. Before the crisis, the Chinese government was controlling 30% of the Chinese economy. US, Japan, EU would probably control, what, 5% of the economy? If US, Japan, EU move to controlling 20% of the economy, and if China remains at 30%, maybe there is a space for a higher degree of understanding and cooperation on subsidization. But this would be the candidates for a reshuffled, reprioritized WTO agenda. Of course, same problem as with multilateralism in general, depends whether the US want to play ball or not. If they want to play ball, fine, but this would be a change as compared to the US position pre-COVID crisis. If US keep not wanting to play ball, then we have to move plurilateral, we have to move to coalitions, including both China and EU, because I don't see a relevant coalition at WTO level not including these two, plus, of course, others. I don't see China leading by itself a coalition. I don't see EU leading by itself a coalition. I see coalitions that would include both. And by the way, this is exactly what happened on the dispute settlement system in the WTO. The patch that EU has proposed worked out, which is to take the appellate body out of the hostage room which the US had locked in. This was done in cooperation between the EU and China. So plan A is with the US, plan B is without the US, but with EU and China.
Professor, you mentioned the world of more government, of more regulation. A question coming in from China. Do you think that China will be hit from a wave of offshoring multinational companies currently producing here? A question from Juan Carlos Abad.
Not a wave, or if a wave, a small wave. So, as I said in my introductory remarks, I don't see deglobalization coming. I see some reconfiguration, some diversification of production systems, whether goods or services, mostly in goods, by the way, and not in services. There'll be a bit of a shortening of some value chain in the manufacturing, while there will be an expansion of value chains in the services area, because I think one of the other consequences of this COVID crisis, which I did not have time to develop, is probably an acceleration of digitalization. An acceleration of that digitalization is an acceleration of the expansion of value chains in the services, because services is an area where the value of what you exchange has very much to do with data, which is a bit less the case in the manufacturing sector. So, to take an example, if I am a producer of electronic devices, or if I'm a producer of drugs, pre-COVID, my value chain was largely dependent on one factory in China. Post-COVID, I will not close my factory in China, but I will probably open 2 other factories in 2 other places. So I don't think it's a wave of deglobalization, but it's a plateau and maybe even a slight move back from the previous process of globalization. I don't see this as a wave. And by the way, I also believe that China and Chinese companies and Chinese firms will, and some have already done that, build their own model of globalization. Some Chinese production systems have moved from southern China to western China, from western China to eastern China and northern China. Some of them are moving to Africa, to Bangladesh, to Vietnam. So it's not a black and white situation where we were in a great wave of globalization and we are moving back. It's more of a reshuffling, reconfiguration. And I think the Chinese companies will play their own role in this reconfiguration.
Good. Perhaps, Professor Ding Yuan, now would be a good time for you to jump in and add your own sharing.
Okay, good. So I don't want to do any own sharing, but I still have a question, and I like to push our Professor Lamy a little bit further down the road about the China-Europe relationship, as he made a beautiful conclusion about this frontline cooperations between these 2 big giants in the world. And when I see in the current newspapers around the world, of course, all started more or less in US before the COVID-19, but now it's becoming also quite prevalent to see that among the European press space is that people are portraying more and more China like a difficult partner, even an unreliable, untrustworthy partner. If that's the case, the risk of decoupling between Chinese economy and the other part of the world will be quite high. So what would be your suggestions to us who are in China, or even to the Chinese authorities, to do something different or to do something better in order to mitigate that threat that China will be seen by the other part of the world as an unsustainable, untrustworthy partner? Thank you very much.
That's a very touchy question, my friend. And I think that you're right, that if I try to get the temperature of European public opinion vis-à-vis China, it's less appreciative since the beginning of the crisis. European public opinion is of the view, and I'm very careful in what I say, that the handling of the beginning of the virus spread in China was not well handled, and that the big public relation campaign, which China has launched since roughly a month, to explain to the rest of the world that China did extremely well and the rest of the world is doing terribly, is not helpful. I don't need to recall the incident that happened in Paris, where the Chinese ambassador had to be summoned by the foreign minister for having used words that the French government thought were insulting from some categories of the population. So I'm answering your question extremely frankly. This is not a good situation, although it still is much better than the US one. Now, this will have a number of consequences, and notably, for instance, in an area which is investment. As you know, the European countries had already been putting together some sort of system to vet foreign investment in some strategic sectors. This will be enhanced by this crisis, not least because some valuations have dropped tremendously. And there is a feeling in some European quarters that Chinese companies, as well, by the way, as American companies, because we all know that American investment banks in this sort of case are also looking for nice opportunities. So there will be turbulences about this, and it's likely that the European system will, for this period, strengthen its vetting of foreign direct investment. This being, by the way, true for China, but also true for the US. I think this is the reality. I could be more diplomatic in painting it in a more rosy way, but you know me, I wasn't trained as a diplomat. You're muted.
I just said, thank you, Pascal, for your very direct and honest answer. I think for all of us based in China, we should do a better job to let our community understand it is our own interest to protect our friendly relationship with the outside world in order to not isolate ourselves. Sometimes if you want to do too much, it's actually counterproductive. I think that's a very good lesson to learn from Pascal. Maybe I hand back to Cedric for housekeeping clothing or whatever, Cedric. Please, Cedric.
Absolutely. I have many more questions from our alumni in China, Africa, Europe, America, but unfortunately our webinar is coming to an end. It shows the high interest in what Pascal Lamy has been sharing with us today. So thank you so much again, Professor Pascal Lamy, Professor Ding Yuan as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
As we come close to an end, just a quick announcement that the next 2 webinars will take place on April the 22nd, Consumer Behavior in a Crisis, with CEO of GDI, and on April 29th, a webinar with the title, The Role of 5G in a COVID-19 Era. More info will be circulated, of course, in our alumni groups. That's it for tonight. Thank you again, Professor Lamy, Professor Ding Yuan. Thank you also, Hannah and team, for the work behind the scenes. And lastly, I wish to thank you all for joining us. Take very good care now. Have a great day. Have a good night.
Thank you.